Hey everybody! Welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening and welcome everyone. This is episode number 115 of CAF's Warbird Tube. Tonight we focus on the art of the leather jacket, and in fact this is such a comprehensive show that we're going to actually end up putting this into two parts. So get yourself ready. Part one tonight, and we'll schedule part two in the near future. But before we get started, please do us a favor. Now, if you haven't already done so, please take a second to like, share, or subscribe and follow us. And if you do subscribe on YouTube, click that bell icon and you will get notifications about new episodes of Warbird Tube when they are posted. Now, as you're watching, you may have some questions. Just type them in the comments section and we will save some time to answer those questions before we sign off tonight. But right now, I would like to introduce to you John Slemp. John is a commercial photographer, but also has quite a passion for leather jackets, and that passion has turned into absolutely wonderful book. It's called Bomber Boys. John, great to have you with us. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Steve. Nice to be here.
Well, tell us a little bit, not in great detail, but how this idea kind of started.
You know, I belong to the EAA chapter here just outside of Atlanta in Lawrenceville, and in 2014 I asked around if anybody had a jacket. I'd like to see it. I had known about them for a long time, but I had never seen a real one. And one of the chapter members brought one in, and it was spectacular. And I made a photograph of it, several pictures actually, and through one of my clients I had met Dorothy Cochran, who's a curator at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum, and just for fun I sent her a couple of pictures and said, "Hey Dorothy, this is something I'm working on, thought you might like to see it." And 58 minutes later I got a separate email from their curator of the aviation clothing collection, Dr. Alex Spencer, and he said, "We have 15 jackets that'll work for your project. When can you be here?" I was shocked. And we went up there a few months later and made pictures, and it just started to take on a life of its own from there, to be honest with you.
Wow. And John, what led you to this? What is your background in aviation and in life in general?
Well, my dad was in the service. I was born in Japan, so I sort of grew up in the Army until he retired. I was 13 at that point, and then I went into the service for almost 11 years, but I was an armor officer. I tried to fly when I was in the service, helicopters and so on, but my eyes wouldn't permit it. But I've always been interested in aviation. When we were kids, we would go watch my dad jump at Sicily Drop Zone at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So C-130s. And when we went to Okinawa, we stopped at Travis Air Force Base in 1964, and I remember it was almost dark when we got off the plane and just walked down the stairs, and there was a chain link fence there, and there were a couple of fighters taking off on the other side, of the runway. And it was just spectacular, the noise and the smoke and the light and the fire coming out of the aircraft, and, just before dark, and it was just utterly spectacular. And then when we were on Okinawa, we would go to the NCO club up at Kadena Air Base on Sundays sometimes for cream beef on toast. And of course the war was on in Vietnam, and the B-52s would take off literally right over our heads. There was the beach, and then there was the road going to the base, and then there was the end of the runway. And it was just mesmerizing. And I don't know why I didn't go in the Air Force, but, I guess my dad's background and so on, it seemed natural. But
I was going to say family tradition to be in the Army, right?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. But, but I've always been interested in aviation. And then in 2008, I just decided to choose a specialty, and aviation was it because of not only do you have the aircraft, but you've got the people, which I find very fascinating. And so it allowed me to do more than just one particular thing. You have portrait photographers and all they do is do portraits, or food photographers and all they do is food and so on. But with aviation, I can shoot aircraft, I can photograph people, I can photograph facilities, any number of things in between, still life, in the form of jackets and so on. So it seemed like a good fit for me because I guess I'm one of those people that's always interested in everything, to be honest with you.
There you go. So when this idea came up, you found your very first leather jacket with the painting on it in real life. You have the invitation to the Smithsonian. Where did the idea for the book? Was this just going to be a simple project where you're going to do some photographs of these, or did you always have a book in mind?
Yeah, no, the book was not in my mind at all, to be honest with you. I thought the pictures might be good fodder for an online discussion about lighting, in a blog post or something, or perhaps an exhibition down the road. But the book was not in my mind at all. And as the number of jackets increased and the diversity of them, I started doing portraits too early on of the guys that I knew through the 8th Air Force Historical Society chapter here in town. We still had a number of veterans who attended those meetings, and so I did some portraits, and then I started hearing the stories. And it became apparent to me that the jackets were an appropriate way to tell their stories. And so it allowed me to marry the portraits and the stories and the jacket photographs all together. And it became obvious that a book would be probably the best way to present it, in a cohesive form.
And that's one of the neat things about the book is that you do weave the story. It's not just the static picture of the jacket, but it's the story that goes with it. And as you're reading those stories and you're looking at the photo, and they're highly detailed photos, they're absolutely works of art, you get the feeling that the jacket is telling the story, even though you're reading the words on the page. And it was a very fascinating read.
Thank you. Yeah, as I got into photographing the jackets and learning more about the artwork on there, the artwork is really what attracted me initially. And because of the variety of the designs and the color, the whole thing, and it just it fascinated me, and and then the story. But essentially, I learned that they're walking billboards. And the number of bombs on there denotes the number of missions. Sometimes they had a unit logo on there, like the 8th you see here, the 8th Air Force logo with the B-17 superimposed. Sometimes they had other symbols on there for either swastikas, denoting German aircraft shot down, parachutes denoting a bailout, just all sorts of little symbols. And you start learning about it, and essentially, it really is a record of the guys' time in combat.
And of course, these all are these A2 jackets are all stamped up property of the U.S. Army Air Corps or the U.S. Army Air Force.
Of course. Yeah. No, they were issued items just like a helmet or a uniform or anything else, and of course, the Army being the Army, they generally want their stuff back. But a number of guys, I lost the jacket and I'll pay for it, or they just flat out stole them, or whatever the case may be, initially, and I found out that technically painting on the jackets was against regulations. But the casualty rate was so high early in the war, especially in the 8th Air Force, it was upwards of 70%, that the artwork on the jackets was perceived as a morale booster, so to speak. It let the guys create an identity around their crew and their units, for that matter. And because it was such a young age, and because they could be gone tomorrow, the commanders realized that, there was a lot of slack cut in that regard. And as long as it wasn't obscene, it was, tacitly condoned, shall we say.
Yeah, very similar to the story we hear of nose art. The nose art on the aircraft became a talisman, a good luck charm that the crews, because as you mentioned, in the early days of the war, the casualty rates were extremely high, and you needed something to be able to kind of cling to. And when you did come back, you said, oh, well, that's because, I had my jacket on, or because we named this airplane flak bait, or whatever the name might be. But whatever little thing you could grasp to help you get through the next mission.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Right.
So you've got the idea, and I'd also like to mention that a lot of the stories that you have are not only in the book, but there are a number of them that are available online as well. You did video recordings from some of the veterans.
Right. Yeah. Early on, I wasn't comfortable just, throwing it on a 35 and trying to record it. I wouldn't say video's my forte. I'm a lot better at it now, but so early on, I just did a handheld recording, on a small digital recorder. So we've got that, and then a friend of mine went with me, and he did several, and so we've tried to incorporate that into the mix. And of course, these guys are, dying off essentially. So it became important to try and to capture that as much as we could.
Where can people find the videos?
We actually created a YouTube channel. It's at WWII-Bomberboys.com, or at WWII Bomberboys. Just look up Bomber Boys, and I think you'll find it on YouTube. There's, I don't know, a dozen or so now, between the small teasers that we've done, and then the longer recordings. The one with Punchy Pal, I believe, is over an hour. But they're pretty fascinating, and some of them are very revealing about how they felt about the war, or things that happened to them in the war. One of the fellows interviewed spent over a year in a VA hospital after the war with PTSD. And in his recording, which I was packing up, and so my friend was doing the actual recording, Michael Schwartz, this fellow said that when he goes to bed at night, he prays to God that he doesn't dream. And I just, and I didn't know that until I saw the finished recording, and it just, it floored me. That's a memory that's seared into his mind, and has been since he was a very young man. He was in his mid-90s when he said this. So this was something he lived with his entire life.
Absolutely amazing. With the first jacket that you saw in the Atlanta area, you've got the invitation to the Smithsonian. How did you expand your search from there?
Well, I tell people that I probably couldn't have done this 20 years ago, to be honest with you, Steve. But because of the power of the internet and email and that sort of thing, it allowed me to reach out to people. And to be honest with you, the Smithsonian shoot was almost a good luck talisman, if you will. You knock on somebody's door and say, "Well, the Smithsonian let me in." And it's like, "Oh, well, you must be somebody," And it really became easy at that point. I won't say easy, but it lent a tremendous amount of credibility. Let me put it that way. And so I started contacting people. I shot at the National Naval Aviation Museum. Unbeknownst to me, they only had one A2, but they had several pretty cool Navy jackets, which I went ahead and shot anyway while I was there. And it just started growing from there, to be honest with you. A fair number of individually owned jackets were, the word went out through the aviation grapevine, and people would call me, and actually I had several jackets sent to me from across the country. They would pay to have it shipped here, and I paid to have it shipped back, and they were insured and so on, and we had no problems whatsoever. And, one jacket in particular was sent to me from Oakland, California, and just a spectacular jacket, a really great story. The son had done a lot of homework on his dad's, personal history, and he had pictures from back in the day. There's a picture of his dad standing next to General Doolittle on the ramp in England wearing this jacket that I photographed. And so that, it was really a treat. I've always been a student of World War II history since childhood. And so it was a real treat to marry those aspects together, in a very physical way. And it almost, I tell people it's almost like touching history in a way.
Any other unusual ways that you found jackets? I mean, you mentioned, going to the jacket and having someone mail it to you, but any others?
Right. Once this became a thing, I got several emails just out of the blue from people. Friends and family would refer me to somebody else. I went up to the 8th Air Force Historical Society chapter in Asheville, North Carolina. Had a fellow contact me from there who was highly involved, and there were 3 jackets there, but there were 6 veterans. So I did portraits of the veterans and shot the 3 jackets all in one day in the Asheville Public Library, of all places. So through various, an EAA, it just, I've spoken to several EAA chapters via Zoom, and, so it's, and people that I had met at Oshkosh, I guess I've been to Oshkosh for 13 years now, aside from COVID year. And I'm sure I'll be going again this year. Well, I've already been, the book has been accepted into the Author's Corner this year. From what I understand, they usually get about 200 submissions and they choose 25, and mine was fortunate enough to be chosen for this year as a participant in that. So I'm looking forward to that. And, just different ways, Steve, I don't know if there's any one in particular that sticks out more than another, to be honest.
In our preliminary conversations, I seem to remember, wasn't there someone from Minnesota who was driving to Florida and stopped?
No, that was Iowa.
Oh, Iowa. Okay.
Yeah. And, and I forget how I got put in touch with them. Yeah, so it was a granddaughter and a niece, I believe. They drove from Iowa to bring me a jacket to Atlanta, and she said they had other business here in town. I wasn't so sure, to be honest with you, but they showed up in my driveway, and we came downstairs, and I had everything all set up, and we photographed the jacket, and she had several other boxes of stuff, and I couldn't really tell until they started opening up the boxes, but they had the dad, Harvey Brundage Jr., or just Harvey Brundage, had been a B-17 waist gunner. And he was always apparently very talented with his hands. He was an older man. I think he was 27 or 28 when he went into the service, and he was already married, had a child, and that was considered old at the time, in relation to the other youngsters, fresh out of high school they were drafting. And but apparently he was always very talented with his hands, and he had carved these spectacular models of aircraft, B-29, B-17, P-51, etc., out of broken pieces of bomber windshields in his spare time between flying missions. And they were beautifully done. They, very correct proportionally. And she started, unveiling these, pulling the bubble wrap off, and I'm like, oh, this is so cool. And so I set them on the light box too, and shot a picture of them as well. I wasn't set up to do it otherwise, time-wise and so on, but it came out to be one of my favorite pictures, to be honest with you, actually. in the project. And, it just, these are little gifts, Apparently he collected these pillowcases that were commonly sold at various training bases and other places, where the aviators were. So he had one from, I think, out in Arizona, and one from England, and so on. And they were silk, with the little tassels around the edge. And then he said, oh yeah, they were on the couch for years, no big deal. And it just, so I photographed several of those, and there's one of them made it right on the front page, across, from another spectacular jacket. And, so there were many, many different things besides the jackets. And I thought it would be kind of cool to help tell the story, in a way that was beyond just the jackets.
Right.
And so I photographed these other items that people brought. Sometimes they brought medals, sometimes they brought records of their bombing missions, typed up from the unit, dog tags, pieces of flak that were collected, after the mission was over. They just landed inside the airplane, spent munitions, so to speak. And, hats and gloves and, just various other things but they were all authentic items, owned by that particular individual. And I thought it just helped tell the story in a little bit more than just just the jacket, so to speak.
Yes. Yeah, it adds as you say, the sense of history to the jacket. I mean, the jacket is telling a story, but these ancillary items help tell that story as well. And even if the veteran is no longer with us, we still can recall that story and extrapolate his experiences to all of the airmen throughout World War II. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, one other thing they brought was this gorgeous panoramic picture of his particular squadron. So there's a B-17 nose on to the photographer, and the entire squadron is on and around this plane. I counted there were 58 guys on one wing and 61 or 62 on the other wing. And there's guys in the nose, and there's a guy straddling each cowling, of the engine, and and then there's a whole line of guys underneath the wing of the aircraft all the way across the front. And on the back it said July of 44. And when I photographed the picture and then blew it up to retouch out some dust spots and so on, I noticed that some of these guys were wearing gloves. And so it must have been a really bad day in England, which is why they weren't flying and why it was possible to get the squadron together to make the picture, But I got to thinking, if these guys weighed 150 pounds, just as a guess, I calculated it was 9 tons on each wing. So it was like, this is cool. This is a pretty good testimonial to how strong that aircraft actually was.
Indeed. When you discovered these jackets, obviously some of them are pushing nearly 80 years old. What kind of condition are the jackets in?
Generally, they're in pretty good shape. I was really surprised at that, to be honest with you. Now, some of them I didn't touch. The ones at the Smithsonian, they had curators handling those, and I didn't touch those at all. And that's fine. I didn't get any great jollies about handling the jackets or not, to be honest with you. They're just an artifact. But some of the other, and a lot of the other instances, I was able to handle the jackets. And, the leather is, being leather, in some instances it was pretty well, how shall we say, formed. The creases and so on, they're there and, have been for decades, and they're going to be there. There's no getting the creases out and so on, or the folds and the sleeves and that sort of thing. I would say that in one particular instance, a museum out at Plains of Fame, the 475th Fighter Group, their jackets are in basically a very large Quonset hut, if you will, where they house also a flying P-38 that was painted up in the colors of the group. But their jackets were basically in wooden cases with glass and not temperature controlled or climate controlled, shall we say. And they were pretty brittle. Some of them were actually flaking apart, as leather will do as it ages. And they were pretty stiff. But, and I talk about that in the book. One of the 390th Memorial Museum in Tucson, I photographed 32 jackets there in one day in 2018. And, that's a dry climate too, but they generally keep them inside, from what I could tell, in a climate controlled area. And they actually hired a professional conservator to come in, and I was put in touch with her, and she wrote a little section for me, which we turned into an FAQ in the back of the book about how to take care of them. And, a lot of it's common sense stuff. Keep them out of the light. Use acid-free boxes if you're going to put them in a box. Don't put them on hangers, because the weight of the jacket will pull down over time, and you can see the hangers, imprinted into the shoulders. No bugs. Climate controlled, normal humidity, let me put it that way. And probably the most important thing she said, and you hear a lot of people talking about this online in various groups, discussion groups, is leather treatments. And people, they want to keep them soft and that sort of thing. And she's like, that's not a good idea. And I asked her why, and she said, because leather treatments are great for things that are used every day. Ball gloves, shoes, gloves, whatever the case may be, because it wears off. But if you put it on a jacket and then store the jacket, over time it attracts dust. And essentially, at that point, dust starts attracting other things, and it leads to accelerated deterioration, to be honest with you. And the other thing, too, she said, is it's not a good idea to wear them. Because the thread, I did notice that the thread on several of the jackets had deteriorated to the point where it was, a sleeve was separating from the torso of the jacket, things like that. And so if you wear it, you're just accelerating that deterioration as well, and you could actually tear the sleeve off at some point. So I said, so what do you do? And she said, well, find a local conservator in your area. There are people that do that for a living. And they will advise you on how to either put it on a mannequin or just store it. One of the ideas I thought was really cool, was to take a long sleeve, plain white cotton T-shirt and to sew up the ends of the sleeves. And she said, wash it first with a detergent that doesn't have an aroma, a smell to it, anything like that. Just some sort of plain Jane detergent, and dry it, and then you stuff the sleeves with acid-free, material, cotton or some such like that, and then you can stick that inside the sleeves of the jacket, and that will give it form and shape without harming it over time. And that's actually one of the things I did when I photographed the jackets. I didn't put anything in the sleeves per se, but I did use some bubble wrap in the torso, just to give it a little bit of form so that it wasn't totally flat. And that worked out fine. In a couple instances I missed and, had to retouch out a little bit because I didn't pull the zipper up high enough. But that was no big deal. People can do a lot of damage to the jackets unintentionally, either by wearing it or putting leather treatment on them and things like that. And I had several people also tell me they wanted to repair the cuffs and the waistband before I photographed it because they had been moth-eaten or just, torn over time, that sort of thing. And I'm like, no, I wanted to shoot it just the way it was. And come to find out, not only from her, that's not a good idea to, well, I should say, one of the other sections we have in the book was written by Jeff Schrader. And I had put the word out on Facebook. I was looking for somebody to talk about collecting the jackets authoritatively. And several people said, contact Jeff Schrader. Well, I'm like, who's Jeff Schrader? Turns out he has his own company, Advance Guard Militaria in Missouri. He buys and sells military stuff. but he's also been an appraiser for Antiques Roadshow for over 10 years. And he's very well known for his expertise in that area. He's actually a collector. He's got a small collection himself now, too. And he said if you start replacing liners or cuffs and waistbands, it actually decreases the value of the jacket and makes it less desirable for collectors, but also for museums. And I'm like, okay, got it, And he wrote a really, I thought, terrific little section for me. I contacted him, told him what I was doing, and he volunteered to do it for nothing, which surprised me. And he's a good writer, too. His mom was an English teacher. So he talks about provenance and, how to value them. Don't spend more money than you can afford to lose. If it's too good to be true, it probably is. Just common sense stuff like that. Again, I wanted to make the book something more than just a pretty picture book and something that I would enjoy reading. And one of the other sections that I forget how I got the idea, but it popped into my head that these jackets have probably influenced fashion design to a great degree, more than I thought. And so I started looking around for a fashion historian. There are people out there, that's what they do for a living. And I found a young lady in New York, told her what I was doing, and she said, yeah, sure. And so I hired her to do that. And when she sent me her finished piece, it was 22 pages typewritten, no pictures. I was shocked. And she told me at the time that she probably found enough information to do her own book on the subject, which I wouldn't be surprised if she does. Yeah. She's a prolific writer and has a blog and lots of online presence. And but let me put it this way: your granddad was probably a lot cooler than you thought he was. And these jackets have absolutely influenced fashion design worldwide since the war, and continue to do so to this day. And you just don't realize it until you read the section. But she outlines it pretty well, how it's had a very profound cultural impact, to be honest with you.
Yeah, it was a very fascinating section of the book to read, along with Jeff's about preservation and value and things like that. They were, and collecting, and just as she draws the parallel between the A2 jacket of World War II and how fashion has moved on through the years, and it's that it's kind of the ancestor of today's fashion trends, right? And what sometimes what comes around goes around. It's cycled back a few times and then gets reintroduced and changed a little bit or slightly, and you see the influence of the A2. And when you read the article, you're like, oh wow, why did I never see that before? It's just
you just don't consciously connect the dots until it's put in front of you. It's like Indiana Jones.
Mm-hmm.
We all know the Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark movies. And that's not an A2, by the way. Right. It's a close knockoff, but we think of it as an A2 because it is so close. And it's like, he could have wore something else, but he didn't. He wore that.
Right.
Yep.
So you touched briefly on photographing the jackets. You put the bubble wrap inside. What does your setup look like when you're photographing them?
Being a commercial photographer, I knew I wanted to show texture.
Right.
I could have lit it with a couple of soft boxes. Basically, it's a cloth box that has an opaque front to it, and light comes through it, but it's very soft. But had I done it that way, I wouldn't have seen any texture. So I decided not to do it that way, and I knew I also wanted to isolate it from any sort of background, because I wanted the jacket to stand on its own, for one, and secondly, I didn't want to do a lot of Photoshop work. I could have shot them on something else, and then cut it out and so on in Photoshop. But to be honest with you, I'm not a Photoshop wizard. I'm okay, but it could be very time consuming to do it that way as well. And so I came up with this idea, and I should say that this is not a new technique. There's a fellow named Albert Watson, who's probably one of the best photographers in the world, who's photographed numerous items on a light box, Elvis's .45 pistol, King Tut's glove, from his from the museum in Cairo, several things like that, an Apollo spacesuit, I think. And there's another fellow named Dan Winters, who's photographed a beautiful collection of antique motorcycle jackets on white. And so this is not a new technique by any stretch. And as Albert says, just about any, capable commercial photographer could have done the pictures, but he said nobody else did. And I'm like, you got a point there, Albert. And so I came up with this light box, if you will. It's just a 4 foot by 4 foot piece of plexiglass, and supported on the top and bottom with a couple of pieces of plywood. And I added a little lip on the inside so it would have something to rest on. I painted the inside of the plywood white because if you leave it brown, that color could come through the box and influence, the light coming through. So I didn't want that. So I put down a piece of foam core on the floor, because if it's a blue carpet or gray or whatever, gray concrete, whatever, again, that color will come through. So I put a piece of foam core down, white, just so, as much as possible, everything inside the box is white. And I laid the jacket down on the box, and again, lightly stuffed it with bubble wrap. And you see on the left there, it's a beauty dish. It's basically a round bowl with a grid on it. And so the light comes out, it's soft, but it's directional because of the grid. And it would come across the top of the jacket and show texture. If you do it right, you could blow out things too, but I did the first jacket this way and it looked great. And so I just decided that's what we're going to do. And all the jackets were shot the same way. And so the light comes across the top of the jacket and it hits that foam core sheet in the back, as you see next to the ladder, and the light coming up through the box also bounces off the two cards on each side. So they actually filled in and, gave it a soft light as well. So I think I was able to pretty much render the jacket using both hard light and soft light. And it worked out much better than I thought it would, to be honest with you. So it was just 3 lights, the 2 lights from underneath and the 1 light, the beauty dish, coming across. And then I would get up on the ladder and shoot down on it. I wasn't directly over it, but I was high enough where it basically looks like I'm directly over it. And, I thought about using a studio stand or a tripod to position the camera directly over it, but it just would have been way too much effort, to get it where I wanted, where I could just get up on a ladder and lean over it and frame it up the way I want. And the camera was connected to my laptop, tethered. We call it shooting tethered, and it would come into the software in about 3 seconds, and I could see exactly what I had. Basically, it's a digital Polaroid, and so if I needed to make an adjustment to the lighting or the position of the jacket, anything along those lines, I could make those corrections and move right along. Basically, I was able to shoot a jacket in about 10 minutes or less.
Okay.
Front and back. I photographed the front and the back. Even if the back had no artwork, I still photographed it for archival reasons. And at some point, I was swapping emails with a fella in England, and he said, "You're photographing the tags, right? The manufacturer's tag." And I'm like, "Well, not really. I wasn't terribly interested in the tags." And he said, "You got to do that because there's people out there that want to know who the manufacturer was and all that." And I'm like, okay. So I started making a concerted effort to shoot the tags as well. And we actually have a PDF with that information on the website that's downloadable. But the tags, they had the manufacturer, and also there was a number in there that denoted the contract number. And so there's a book written by a fellow in England, the Eastman Leather Company, and I forget his name. Off the top of my head. But he put out a book that had all that information in it. And so from there, I created the PDF, which you can download, that has the contract number, the date the contract was let, how many were in the contract, et cetera, et cetera. And if we know the guy's name, his unit, and so on. So that's all in there, if people really want to get that granular with it. I'm told that there are people who can look at a jacket and tell you who the manufacturer is just by looking at it, because there were slight differences. The color of the waistband and the sleeve cuffs went from very dark brown, almost black, to almost a rust red, which really surprised me when I first saw those. There were 18 different manufacturers across the country, and most of them were located in the Northeast, because that's where the garment industry was for the most part. There were a few in Pennsylvania, there were a few around Chicago, but generally they were in New York, New Jersey. And at the time, what happened was the government would procure all the parts of something. In this instance, they would procure the leather, they would procure the liner material initially, which was silk, and then went to cotton later on. They would procure the waistband and cuff, wool, the zippers, the snaps, everything that went into making that jacket, the government would procure, and they gave it to the manufacturer along with a diagram and said, build us a jacket. And for about $8 and a quarter, they would kick out a jacket. And some of the jackets have an AN stamp, which you can see the AN, and that stands for Army Navy. And they had inspectors that went to the various facilities, and they would check the jacket to make sure it adhered to the specifications required. And if it passed, they would stamp it and move on. Not every jacket had it, but generally they would check I guess various lots and so on. The best I can tell, people have asked me how many were made, and going from data from this fella in England and from the Eastman book and so on, best I can tell, there were probably about 750,000 that were made. They came into the inventory in 1931. They were not new to, World War II. But because of the Great Depression and the limited budgets for the military through the Great Depression in the mid-30s, some years 500 are made, some years there's no record kept at all of how many were made. But the quantities were initially very small. And then as 1939, 1940, 41, as it became clear that we were probably going to be involved in the war, the quantities dramatically increased. 15,000, 25,000, 50,000, I believe, is the max let out in any particular one contract. But from what I can tell, about 750,000 were produced.
Amazing. Well, John, you mentioned the book will be at the Author's Corner at the EIA Air Venture Flying Convention, taking place at the end of July. Where else can folks find the book?
Well, they can find it on the website, www.WWII.com. I put the WWII World War II in front of Bomber Boys because I didn't want the FBI showing up on my doorstep had we just done Bomber Boys. It is available on Amazon as well. It's available now at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum bookstore. EAA is going to start carrying it in their bookstore in Oshkosh. Let's see, the Florida Air Museum down at Sun and Fun, they took a few copies when I was down there last week. let's see, the San Diego Air and Space Museum has a few copies. The 390th Memorial Museum in Tucson bought 66 copies from me, and I was out there in January and signed a bunch of them for me, for them, I should say, and they've been terrific. They actually used some of the jackets as a fundraiser. This is a use that I never contemplated, but they created what they called an Adopt a Jacket campaign, and they used it as a fundraising mechanism to purchase new display cases for the jackets. And they also, when they pulled out some of the jackets to put them in the new cases, a moth flew out of one of the cases, which horrified the curator. And they went back to the pictures that I had done in 2018 to compare to what the current condition of the jacket. Fortunately, there was no great change, but that was another use that I had never contemplated. And all the museums, by the way, that participated, there were 12, I gave them high-resolution copies of the files for their records. And frankly, they would have never had these pictures otherwise. Most museums, I've come to find out, have very limited budgets, very limited staff. They're always understaffed and under-budgeted. It just seems to be the nature of the business, to be honest with you. And so they were very happy to have the pictures. I have come to also realize that museums are basically America's closet,
right.
And stuff that either are culturally or historically significant wind up in museums. Not always, but, if people are thinking straight, they'll try to get it into some museum or entity that can preserve it. And so, I encourage people to support museums. They're pretty cool places, but, I also learned that because of budgets and so on, generally they only display 3 to 5% of what they actually have. So, but, creating an exhibit, whatever form it might take, again, costs money and time. And so they can't always change them out as quickly as they might otherwise. And and the other thing I learned too, Steve, is that these jackets are going to go away sometime. They are going to deteriorate to the point where they're going to be dust. And so, I felt really quite privileged, to be honest with you, to photograph these jackets, that hopefully these images will last for a long time and have captured this portion of our history and our culture. So, again, it was quite a privilege, to be honest with you. And also they're available at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton. I tried to shoot there in 2015. To make a long story short, they wanted a letter from a publisher, which I didn't have. And so I kind of put it in the back of my mind. I knew they had Jimmy Stewart's jacket there. And in 2021, a friend of mine was there, and he ran into Mr. Tillotson, who's the director of the museum, and actually got his card, which he forwarded to me. And I contacted him, and he said, well, we now have an office in New York City, a PR office that handles requests like this. Talk to them, and I filled out the form, and I sent him some of the pictures along, I've shot at the Smithsonian, shot at the 390th, et cetera, et cetera. And a month later, they said, come on down. And so in January of last year, 2022, I went there and photographed 10 jackets from their collection. A Tuskegee Airman jacket, Jimmy Stewart's jacket, a fellow, Philip Rasmussen, who got off the ground during the Pearl Harbor attack and shot down a Japanese plane and got his jacket. A flight nurse, a Medal of Honor recipient, Hub Zemke, who was a very well-known fighter pilot in England. I think I said a flight nurse, a Tuskegee Airman's jacket, and just one jacket that had some really cool artwork on it. So it was a treat, and so they have books available in their bookstore now, too.
Awesome. Well, right now, John, we are going to turn things over to our audience and see what questions they have before we wrap up tonight. There you are, John. Thank
Hi.
you for that great presentation and yeah, just a fascinating story about these jackets. We've got a couple of questions from the audience, but one that just popped into my head is, and this is always a hard one to answer because it's like asking a pilot what's his favorite airplane. But what's your favorite jacket that you've photographed so far?
For lots of reasons, I was really thrilled to photograph Jimmy Stewart's jacket.
Yeah.
He was a personal hero of mine, and not only was he a fine actor, but he didn't have to join the military. And he was actually probably the first actor of note in Hollywood to join the military. He actually joined before World War II started as a private. And so, for that reason, I think that's probably my favorite jacket. If I had to pick one, that would be it.
All right. Okay. One of our audience members, and I don't know if we've covered this or not, but was the artwork that was painted on the jackets, was that done by the same person who might have done the nose art? And were they using the same kind of paint, or did they use different kind of paint on leather versus the airplanes?
From what I've been able to find out, discern, they were oil-based paints.
Okay.
Acrylics didn't come along until the 50s, from what I understand. And so sometimes people who painted nose art also did jackets, but not exclusively either way. And so sometimes it was individual crewmen. At the time, you have to remember that sign painting in the early part of the 20th century, whatever it was, the early 1900s, was a profession. So there were a number of sign painters who were drafted into the service, and they used their skills to paint nose art, to paint jackets, etc. And so, and from what I understand, also, not all the nose art did not always match the jackets either. Somebody has asked me that.
Oh, okay.
So that's what I was able to find out about that.
Now, with nose art itself, there's the chemical processes. Basically, the paint and the solvents and things that were used in World War II. Basically, the paint is trying to reject itself from the aluminum, and so there's special techniques that need to be in place to preserve the nose art as it is. And is that same sort of thing happen with the leather, or oil based on leather has a different bond?
I'm not a painter per se. I vaguely remember reading somewhere where there was some sort of preparatory step done, but I can't tell you what it was. I believe on the modern jackets where people are using acrylics, there is some sort of preparation that's used so that it adheres better to the leather. Okay. But I don't know about during World War II.
Okay. Gary Daniels, who's a regular viewer of and I see the nod. You must know Gary as well. He's an aviation photographer. He'd like you to dive a little more into your portable lighting setup that you use when you're photographing the jackets.
Sure. Yeah, Gary actually bought a book and wrote a very nice review. Hi, Gary. And basically, it's just 3 lights. It's 2 strip lights underneath, coming in from each side underneath the plexiglass, which illuminates the plex underneath and comes up. And then the beauty dish comes across the top from the top of the jacket on down towards that foam core card that I just leaned up against the ladder, and the other 2 cards on each side. So the light coming up through the box bounces off all 3 cards. And then, of course, the light from the beauty dish bounces off that card. But because it's right above the beauty dish that skims across the top of the surface, we also get texture. So I did the first jacket that way, and I was pretty pleased with it. There were a few jackets where it was kind of problematic because I couldn't quite get the jacket situated where it wouldn't shine. So I had to finagle it basically. And sometimes it just, it blew out in small sections, but that's the price you pay for showing texture sometimes. And I was okay with that, to be honest with you. it's I really did, because I think that's part of the charm is seeing the shine on the jackets as well, because it did, that's the nature of the material. So
And
hopefully that answers your question, Gary.
and also you had mentioned Photoshop before and using it to touch up little bits and pieces, but really I think your intent was to capture these jackets in one image without having to do any kind of manipulation or work with them at all, and really capture them in their best light.
Right. Yes. Yeah. So the lighting ratio was important in that regard. Maybe that's what Gary was asking about. The lighting ratio basically coming up through the light box was about a stop down, 50% different than the light coming across the top. So it was white, or it was almost white. And so using the software, I was able to bring it up to pure white without blowing out. And also during the pandemic, I actually spent a lot of time learning a lot more about Photoshop. And so I learned how to, and I should say this, initially I was torn on how much to saturate the colors. Mm-hmm. Because they are old jackets now, a lot of them have faded a fair amount, to be honest with you. And so at first I didn't really pop up the saturation too much, but then I started thinking about it, and it occurred to me that maybe we can accentuate the saturation a little more so that it'd be closer to what it was like when it was new. And so I tried to sort of straddle that fence, if you will. And I think I achieved a happy medium, if you will, without making it, too Mickey Mouse colors in that regard. And in the Photoshop, I was able to learn how to select individual colors. So I could select a green and pop that up if I needed to, or a red or a blue or whatever, without affecting the rest of the image. So it really does, once you learn how to use it, it gives you a tremendous amount of control. Yeah, so, but it's an essential tool. It's the digital darkroom these days, and commercial photographers need to know what they're doing with it, at least to some extent. Like I said, I'm not a wizard by any stretch, but I'm a pretty good retoucher, if nothing else.
There you go. Now we've got these great images, wonderful photography that went into the book, but the book itself is a work of art. How did that process come together? Obviously someone worked on the design of the book and really helped bring this all together.
Oh yeah. So in 2014, I shot the biggest job of my career for an agency in Houston for Phillips 66 Aviation Fuels down in Opelika, Florida. And the art director on the job was a fellow named Darren Guillory. And I just kept in touch with him. We hit it off. We did some good work there. The website that they eventually created won a Gold Addy in Houston 2 years later. And it was all the pictures we had done from that job. So the client was extremely happy. I enjoyed working with Darren and so on. And I kept in touch with him. And at one point, the jackets came up and he said, "Oh, I'd love to design the book for you and I'll do it for free." And I said, "No." I said, "I'll pay you." And there are two reasons why. One is I want to have control, but also I want to respect your time and your talent. Right. And so that's what we did. And I fed him the pictures and the stories and so on, and he started putting it together. Well, I should say initially he created we created a book proposal that I shopped around a little bit to several publishers and so on, but it had a wonderful look and feel to it. And because doing a book proposal and just showing text and maybe a few pictures in a PDF is okay, but we actually turned it into a 50-page booklet, and it looked spectacular. And we started sending that around, and people started paying attention. And he had some wonderful design ideas. He's a really very talented designer, and so I knew he was the guy for it. And so when we started on the actual production, we spent pretty much all year last year working on the book production. It just, it turned out to be 398 pages. It just kept growing. And it has an index, which none of the other books on the subject have. But he had some really lovely little touches here and there, and just, we didn't want to overcrowd it. So there's lots of white space with the text and so on. And the pictures are nice and bright. And we included several aircraft illustrations from a fellow named John Mollison. It occurred to me at one point that there's probably a lot of people out there who have no idea what a P-17 looks like these days, if they're not involved in CAF or whatever. And, so John was kind enough to contribute several really lovely illustrations. And let me show you this one here. So Darren had this idea to put Punchy Powell's airplane. Punchy was a friend of mine, P-51 pilot on D-Day, and he put Punchy's airplane on the inside of the dust jacket, which I was just, when I saw that, I'm like, that is spectacular. So it's essentially almost 3 feet across.
Yeah.
And we're thinking people are going to frame this. And when I initially contacted Mollison about using it, I had seen the picture, I forget somewhere, and I asked his permission to use it in the book. He said no too. And I'm like, what's the deal? And he said, well, this was done in 2000 and I can do it a lot better now. And so he redid it. And he, it's marvelous. And, just couldn't have been nicer. Again, he didn't charge me anything for it. Once people got on board with this, there were several people who were as passionate as I was about it. And they wanted to and be a part of it without, the money aspect didn't really enter the equation. And so, but going back to Darren and the design, he worked on it diligently, for several months, and would present sections to me and so on, and we would go over it. And I made really very few changes, graphically speaking, or recommendations even. He's really on top of his game and knows what he's doing. And when we thought we were close, I hired a professional editor to go through it and make sure my English was up to speed. And she made over 1,500 changes to it. and at one point I said to her, Jill, I thought I was fairly decent with the English language. And she said, you are. And I'm like, well, you could have fooled me. But a lot of it was these really obscure punctuation treatments and all of that kind of stuff, and standardizing, like at the top of each page, we would put the guy's name. And sometimes I knew, the guy's middle initial. See, like here we have Arthur Fowler, and sometimes we knew Arthur T. Fowler or whatever. She said, no, it's got to be all uniform. So we took out all the middle initials and stuff like that, And it's a big book. It's 12 by 12 inches, about an inch thick. It weighs 6 pounds. And we printed it here in the States. I thought it was important that we print it here in the States. I didn't want it stuck on a boat for 4 months either. Yeah. And it just, when I went to the printer and we're physically running the sheets off on the presses in Houston, the guys at the press were like, this is fantastic. And I actually sold books to the guys on the press. One of the guys had 2 sons in the Air Force, and he bought them before they even were printed. Wow. Before they were bound. And, and I'm like, well, that's probably a pretty good sign. and it just, all these things came together, and it's already won a silver award in some, I forget the name of the competition, but overseas for publication design. And it was shortlisted for the Art Directors Club in New York for their annual competition. Which is it's a worldwide competition. So we felt very happy about even being shortlisted, because they get thousands of submissions. And we think it's going to continue to do well, and some other submissions we're waiting to hear on. But, between Darren's contribution and, Mollison's illustrations and Laura's contribution with the fashion history, and the FAQ section on the conservation, and Schrader's contribution on collecting and so on, and the index, we think we've put together a pretty decent book on the subject. And like I said, I wanted to make a book that I wanted to read, so I find the stories fascinating as well. And I'm sure I'll go back to them again and again at some point.
Oh, definitely. Yes, and as you're going through the volume of information that's in the book, not just the incredible pictures, but the volume of information, the histories, the index, as you said, it all comes together in a magnificent package. And that's also why we're going to have another show with you. We're going to have you back in about a month to talk even more about this, because there's just so much within the story that we can't get it in an hour. So, John, thank you for joining us tonight, and thanks to our audience for sticking with us. And take a look at the CAF website, and you'll see the upcoming events. I think it's going to be just about a month from now. So we'll have John back and talk more about this wonderful book. So again, thank you, John, for joining us, and thanks everyone for being a part of our webinar tonight. As always, if you have ideas for topics or some feedback, suggestions, whatever, send Leah Block an email at media@cafhq.org. Thanks again to John for joining us, and we'll see you in just a couple of weeks. Until next time, from the Commemorative Air Force, I'm Steve Buss. Have a good night.
Thank you, Steve. Bye-bye.